Her ex-husband mocked her in court, but when the judge exposed the truth, he was left speechless. The courtroom was packed. Spectators whispered among themselves, eager to witness yet another high-profile divorce. At the plaintiff's table sat a woman, poised yet quiet, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across from her, her ex-husband lounged back in his chair with a smirk, exuding the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The judge's gavel pounded against the wooden bench, silencing the murmurs. This wasn't just another divorce case, it was a spectacle. The ex-husband's lawyer rose first, his voice smooth and commanding. "Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman, a self-made man who built his empire from the ground up. He provided everything for his wife, yet she now seeks to take what he has rightfully earned." He glanced toward the woman, who remained impassive. She contributed nothing financially. She lived off his success, and now she demands half of everything. The courtroom murmured in response, the air thick with quiet judgment. The woman's lawyer, an older man with a calm demeanor, stood next. "Your Honor, we will provide evidence that tells a much different story." His words were measured, his confidence subtle yet undeniable. But before he could continue, the ex-husband interrupted with a chuckle. "Evidence? There's nothing she could possibly say that would change the facts," he sneered. The judge shot him a warning glance, but the damage had been done. The courtroom had already begun to side with him. The ex-husband reveled in the attention, flashing a charismatic grin at the judge. "Let's be honest here," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "My ex-wife lived a comfortable life. She never had to work a day in her life, never had to struggle like I did. I gave her everything." He gestured around the courtroom as if expecting applause. "I built my company from the ground up while she spent my money on whatever caught her eye. And now, after all my generosity, she wants to rob me blind." The judge, an older man with years of experience handling these cases, remained expressionless, his sharp eyes scanning both parties. "This is a court of law, not a stage for dramatics," he reminded the ex-husband. "Proceed with the facts." The woman didn't react to the insults. She sat still, her gaze fixed on the table before her. If she was hurt by his words, she gave no sign. But those who paid close attention, like the judge, noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly against the polished wood. Despite the verbal attacks, the woman remained silent, allowing her ex-husband to dig his own grave with every word. Her lawyer, however, was keenly aware of the game being played. He leaned toward her and whispered, "Patience. Let him talk." She simply nodded. The ex-husband continued, growing bolder with each passing moment. "She never even had a real job. She spent her days attending charity galas, shopping, and throwing extravagant parties with my money. I tolerated it for years, thinking it was harmless, but now she wants to take what she never worked for." There was a faint shift in the woman's expression, almost imperceptible, a flicker of something hidden beneath her composed exterior. If her ex-husband noticed, he didn't care. He was too busy relishing the moment. "Honestly," he added with a chuckle, "I should be the one suing her for emotional distress." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge, despite his professionalism, sighed in disapproval at the display. The ex-husband leaned forward, eyes gleaming with triumph. "I just don't see the point of this case, Your Honor. She has no claim to anything I own." He turned toward his ex-wife, shaking his head in mock pity. "You should have been grateful, but instead, you decided to be greedy." His words hung in the air, sharp as daggers. The woman's lawyer remained still, biding his time. The woman, however, finally lifted her gaze. Her ex-husband met her eyes, and for the briefest moment, a shadow of doubt flickered across his face. There was something in her expression, something unwavering, something unreadable. But he quickly dismissed it. He had already won in the court of public opinion. What could she possibly say that would change the outcome now? The ex-husband's lawyer continued his defense, painting a picture of a selfless man betrayed by an ungrateful wife. Mr. Dawson, he said, turning to the judge, built his empire with his own hands. He expanded his business into a multi-million-dollar corporation while his wife contributed nothing. And now, after filing for divorce, she expects to take half of it? He scoffed, shaking his head. The judge nodded, signaling for the woman's lawyer to respond. Finally, the older man stood. Your Honor, my client has listened patiently as her character was torn apart. But now, I believe it is time to introduce the facts. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward the judge. I urge the court to review these documents carefully. The ex-husband frowned, suddenly uneasy for the first time. As the judge opened the folder, a hush fell over the courtroom. His eyes moved across the pages, his expression unreadable. A bead of sweat formed on the ex-husband's forehead as he shifted in his seat. What's this? He asked, forcing a chuckle. The woman's lawyer folded his hands together. Financial records. Business transactions. Ownership agreements. The judge's eyebrows raised slightly. Mr. Dawson, he said slowly, do you still stand by your statement that your wife contributed nothing to your success? The ex-husband's confident smirk faltered for the first time. I don't know what you mean. The woman's lawyer calmly took another folder and handed it to the judge. In fact, Your Honor, what these documents reveal will prove quite the opposite. The courtroom held its breath as the judge continued to read, his frown deepening. The ex-husband, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced toward his lawyer, but even his attorney looked concerned. The tide had shifted, and the once assured man was now drowning in uncertainty. The judge's sharp gaze settled on the ex-husband, his fingers tapping slowly against the thick pages of the documents. The tension in the room thickened as silence stretched between them. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice steady yet pointed. Mr. Dawson, are you certain that your wife had no financial involvement in your business? Because these documents suggest otherwise. The ex-husband's lawyer quickly leaned toward him, whispering something in hushed urgency, but it was clear that the man's confidence was wavering. Shifting in his seat, the ex-husband forced a laugh, though it lacked the arrogance from earlier. I don't know what this is supposed to prove. I handled all the financial matters. Maybe she signed a few papers here and there, but that doesn't mean she was involved in the business. The woman's lawyer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, what my client signed were not just a few papers. She was an equal partner in the company's founding, both legally and financially. Without her initial investment, there would have been no empire to begin with. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom as the ex-husband's smirk completely vanished. He turned toward his ex-wife, his expression darkening. That's ridiculous, he scoffed, though his voice held a slight tremor. She didn't contribute anything. The judge, unbothered by his outburst, carefully lifted a specific page from the stack. According to this document, he said, reading aloud, your wife provided the seed capital that allowed the company's formation. These legal agreements list her as a co-founder, giving her rightful claim to half of the business. The color drained from the ex-husband's face as the realization hit him. He had walked into court expecting an easy victory, believing his ex-wife to be powerless, but the truth had blindsided him. His attempts at public humiliation had backfired in the worst possible way. The woman, still seated with perfect composure, simply tilted her head slightly as if silently asking, "Who's the fool now?" The judge set the documents aside and folded his hands. "Mr. Dawson, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before we proceed any further." The ex-husband's lawyer stood quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. If my client had known these documents would be introduced, he would have prepared a proper response. I request an adjournment to review the claims being made." The judge, unimpressed, leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Dawson has been making claims all morning, ridiculing his ex-wife with certainty. Are you suggesting that he was speaking without full knowledge of his own company's foundation?" The lawyer hesitated, clearly realizing the trap lay before him. If he argued that his client wasn't aware of the legal agreements, it would make him look incompetent. If he insisted that his client was aware, then the lies told in court would be exposed even further. The ex-husband clenched his jaw, glaring at his ex-wife as if she had personally betrayed him. But she didn't flinch. She simply watched, silent yet powerful, as the courtroom waited for what would happen next. For the first time that morning, the courtroom no longer viewed the ex-husband as the successful businessman in control of the situation. The shift was almost tangible, like a sudden change in the wind before a storm. The woman, who had spent most of the trial enduring his insults, had revealed herself as someone much more formidable than anyone had expected. The judge glanced between the two parties before making a decision. "We will proceed without adjournment. This court must determine the truth, and we are closer to that now than when this trial began." The ex-husband tightened his grip on the edge of the table, his mind racing for a way out. He had built his image on being untouchable, the sole architect of his success. But now, with undeniable proof in front of him, he could feel the weight of reality settling on his shoulders. His ex-wife, the woman he had dismissed as weak and dependent, had played a far greater role in his empire than he had ever admitted, even to himself. And now, with the entire courtroom watching, there was nowhere left to hide. The woman's lawyer stepped forward, his tone measured. "Your Honor, my client has remained silent until now, not because she had nothing to say, but because she wanted the truth to speak for itself." He turned toward the judge, meeting his gaze with certainty. "The documents presented today are only part of the evidence we have gathered. There is more." The ex-husband's fingers twitched as if he wanted to grab the papers and tear them apart. Instead, he forced another laugh, though it sounded hollow. "This is absurd. If she was so involved, why did she never say anything before?" For the first time, the woman spoke. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable strength beneath it. "Because I trusted you," she said simply. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The ex-husband blinked, caught off guard. "I believed in your vision," she continued, "and I was willing to let you take the spotlight because I thought we were a team. But that wasn't enough for you. You needed to rewrite history and erase me from it." Her words were not emotional, nor did they drip with resentment. They were just facts. Cold, undeniable facts. The judge studied her, then turned to the ex-husband. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Would you care to explain why these legal documents contradict every statement you've made today?" The ex-husband's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to respond but quickly realized that no excuse would be good enough. He had spent the trial belittling his ex-wife, portraying her as a financial burden, only for the evidence to prove she had been the foundation of his success. His lawyer hesitated before placing a hand on his arm, signaling him to remain silent. But the ex-husband couldn't. His pride had taken too many blows in too short a time. "This is a setup," he snapped, turning back to his ex-wife. "You were supposed to be done with all of this. You never wanted credit before, so why now?" She tilted her head, unfazed. "Because I never thought you would stoop so low to take it all away from me," she replied. "I didn't need recognition, but I will not be erased." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and the judge raised a hand for silence. He turned his attention to the woman. "Mrs. Dawson, do you have further evidence to present?" Her lawyer nodded, sliding another document across the table. "This is a financial ledger detailing company earnings in the early years. As you will see, the investments made by my client were crucial to the business's initial survival." The judge scanned the document, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Dawson," he said finally, "did you or did you not accept these funds from your wife?" The ex-husband's shoulders tensed. He was trapped. Any answer he gave would only further his downfall. He had underestimated her, and now, he was standing on the edge of a crumbling foundation. His empire, his reputation, everything he had fought to protect, was slipping away. And as he looked into his ex-wife's steady gaze, he realized something chilling: she hadn't come here for revenge. She had come here for justice. And she was winning. The ex-husband's hands balled into fists, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to deny everything, but the weight of the documents before him made it impossible. Every number, every signature, every transaction was a testament to the truth he had tried so hard to bury. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but the words barely registered. His world was unraveling, thread by thread, right before his eyes. The courtroom, once a stage for his mockery, had become a cage closing in around him. The woman's lawyer took his time, methodically flipping through the records. "This ledger, Your Honor, details a $500,000 transfer from my client's personal account to Mr. Dawson's business during its first year." He turned the page. "This next document is a contract signed by both parties, outlining the agreement that she would hold equal ownership." The judge's expression darkened as he read over the details. "This directly contradicts everything you've claimed today, Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice laced with controlled displeasure. A murmur spread through the courtroom as the reality of the situation settled in. The ex-husband, who had spent the entire trial ridiculing his former wife, now sat frozen in humiliation. The woman, on the other hand, remained composed, her expression unreadable. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The judge exhaled heavily, setting the documents down with care. "Mr. Dawson," he said slowly, "would you like to revise your previous statements regarding your ex-wife's role in your business?" The ex-husband's jaw clenched, his pride warring with the undeniable evidence. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's judgment pressing against him, the silent realization that he had been exposed. I may have overstated things," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lawyer arched an eyebrow. "Overstated?" he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Mr. Dawson, you did not merely overstate, you outright lied to this court. And now, faced with irrefutable proof, you expect leniency?" The ex-husband's lips pressed into a thin line, but he remained silent. The woman's lawyer continued. Your Honor, my client not only provided financial support but actively participated in key business decisions during the company's early years. We have testimonies from former employees confirming that she was responsible for securing major contracts. The ex-husband flinched. He had been so careful to erase her from the company's history, but now, every forgotten truth was coming back to haunt him. The judge gestured for the new evidence to be handed over, scanning the signed statements with growing displeasure. "This is damning," the judge admitted, glancing up at the ex-husband. "Not only did you falsely claim sole ownership of the business, but you actively tried to deceive this court." He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharper now. "I take perjury very seriously, Mr. Dawson." A visible shudder passed through the ex-husband's frame. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to humiliate his ex-wife, but now, with the judge's words echoing in his mind, he realized something chilling: he was dangerously close to ruining himself. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The gravity of the judge's words settled over the spectators like a thick fog. The ex-husband's arrogance had melted away completely, replaced by the stark reality that his actions carried real consequences. His lawyer, now visibly rattled, attempted to salvage what was left. "Your Honor, my client was merely mistaken. He did not intentionally mislead the court." But the judge wasn't convinced. "Mistaken?" he repeated, voice laced with disbelief. He spent the last hour ridiculing his ex-wife, painting her as a parasite, while fully aware of her contributions. "That is not a mistake. That is deceit." The ex-husband swallowed hard, sweat forming at his temples. He had spent years carefully curating his image, a self-made man, a visionary leader, but now that image was crumbling at his feet. He risked glancing at his ex-wife, expecting to see smug satisfaction, but instead, she simply looked at him with quiet finality. She wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. The truth was more powerful than any insult he had thrown at her. The woman's lawyer presented yet another document. This is a copy of a legal agreement signed 5 years ago when Mr. Dawson sought to buy out my client's share of the company. However, the transaction was never finalized. The judge's brow furrowed. "Which means?" The lawyer smiled faintly. "Which means that, legally speaking, my client still owns half of the business." A stunned silence filled the room. Even the ex-husband's lawyer appeared blindsided by the revelation. The ex-husband's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind reeled. He had assumed wrongly that his ex-wife had no fight left in her. That she had walked away without securing her rightful claims. But now, in front of everyone, it was revealed that she still held power over the company he had long considered his alone. The judge exhaled slowly before delivering his next words. "Mr. Dawson, it appears you not only attempted to defraud this court, but you may have knowingly operated under a false pretense of ownership." Panic flickered across the ex-husband's face. That can't be right," he stammered. She never wanted the business. She never acted like a partner. If she had real control, why didn't she say something before?" The woman's voice was calm when she finally responded. "Because I trusted you to do the right thing." The courtroom hung on every word. "But I realize now that trust was misplaced. I should have fought for my rights sooner." Her gaze never wavered. "But I'm here now." The ex-husband's lawyer scrambled for a new strategy. "Your Honor, even if she still technically holds a stake in the business, my client has been the one managing it for years. Surely that counts for something." The judge tapped his fingers against the desk. "It certainly does. It means he has knowingly made executive decisions without the proper legal authority. That alone opens the door for serious legal consequences. The ex-husband's breath hitched. This was going far beyond a divorce settlement. The weight of the situation pressed down on everyone in the courtroom. The ex-husband, once so smug and untouchable, now sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed empire on the verge of collapse. His ex-wife, once the target of his ridicule, had revealed herself as the true power behind their shared success. The judge straightened in his chair, his expression unreadable. Given the overwhelming evidence, this court will deliberate on the appropriate course of action. The ex-husband gripped the edge of the table, his confidence completely shattered. He had walked into court expecting an easy win. Instead, he was now facing the very real possibility of losing everything, not just his money, but his reputation, his business, and perhaps even his freedom. And as the judge's gavel slammed down, signaling a recess before the final ruling, one thing was painfully clear. He had underestimated the woman sitting across from him. And now, there was no going back. The courtroom doors swung shut as the judge exited for deliberation, leaving a thick tension behind. The ex-husband sat motionless, his once confident demeanor now stripped away. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he barely registered the words. Every argument he had prepared, every insult he had thrown, had been rendered meaningless by cold, hard facts. His ex-wife hadn't just won the moral victory, she had exposed him completely. The whispers of the courtroom spectators felt suffocating, a reminder that his humiliation was no longer private. The woman, meanwhile, remained steady. She had walked into court knowing the truth would eventually surface, but even she hadn't expected such a complete shift in power. She glanced at her ex-husband, who refused to meet her gaze. There was no satisfaction in his downfall, only the quiet understanding that justice was finally being served. The years of dismissal, of erasure, of being treated as nothing, had all led to this moment. No longer was she the forgotten woman behind his empire. She was the one who had built it, and now, the world knew the truth. When the judge finally returned, the room fell into silence. He settled back into his chair, his gaze sharp as he addressed the court. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds that Mrs. Dawson retains legal ownership of 50% of the company. A collective gasp spread through the room. The ex-husband's head snapped up, his eyes wide in horror. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mr. Dawson's misrepresentation of assets, as well as his failure to disclose his ex-wife's legal ownership, constitutes fraudulent behavior. As such, this court will appoint a financial auditor to assess potential penalties. The ex-husband's world crumbled in real time. He had been so certain that he could walk away unscathed, that he could cast his ex-wife aside like an afterthought. Now, not only had he lost half of the business, but he was facing legal consequences that could strip him of even more. His lawyer attempted to object, but the judge silenced him with a firm look. "Your client misled this court," he stated. "That is not something I take lightly. Be grateful I am not referring this case for criminal investigation, yet." The finality in his words sent a visible shudder through the ex-husband's frame. The tables had turned completely. The ex-husband, once so smug and untouchable, was now reduced to a man grasping at whatever power he had left. The judge's ruling had changed everything. The company he had spent years claiming as his own was no longer solely under his control. He had dismissed his ex-wife, erased her contributions, and yet, here she was, still standing, still holding half of what he had built. The realization was crushing. Every decision he made from this point forward would require her approval. For the woman, it wasn't about revenge. She had never wanted to destroy him, only to reclaim what was rightfully hers. And now, she had done just that. She looked at the judge and nodded. "I accept the court's ruling," she said firmly. The ex-husband clenched his fists, barely able to contain his frustration. There was no appeal, no loophole, no clever strategy that could undo what had just happened. He had mocked her, belittled her, and now, she held the kind of power he had always feared. The power to stand on her own. The media wasted no time reporting on the trial's shocking outcome. Headlines painted the ex-husband as a fraud, a man who had tried to erase his ex-wife's legacy and failed spectacularly. His business associates began distancing themselves, wary of the legal troubles that now surrounded him. Investors hesitated, uncertain of the company's future now that ownership had been split in half. The carefully constructed empire he had fought so hard to control was starting to slip through his fingers. Meanwhile, the woman received a flood of support. Former colleagues reached out, many admitting that they had always known the truth but had remained silent out of fear. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years sent messages of encouragement. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She hadn't just won in court, she had reclaimed her identity, her worth. The weight of years of dismissal had finally lifted. She had fought for herself, and she had won. In the days following the trial, the ex-husband tried to regain control of the narrative. He issued a statement downplaying the ruling, claiming it was nothing more than a misunderstanding. But the damage had been done. His credibility was in ruins, and every attempt to salvage his reputation only made things worse. Clients began pulling their contracts, unwilling to associate with a man whose integrity had been publicly shattered. He had spent years building his empire, but now, he was watching it crumble brick by brick. The woman, on the other hand, had choices to make. With half the company now legally hers, she had the power to reshape its future. She could sell her shares, walk away with financial security, or she could step in and take an active role, something she had been denied for years. As she looked over the documents, she realized something. This was never just about money or recognition. It was about proving to herself that she was stronger than the narrative he had forced upon her. And now, with the future in her hands, she was ready to decide what came next. The ex-husband's downfall was swift. Without the ability to make unilateral decisions, he struggled to maintain control of the company. His employees, once loyal to him, began questioning his leadership. Investors demanded reassurances, but there were none to give. The board of directors, seeing the instability he had created, started discussions of removing him altogether. His arrogance had been his undoing, and now, he was paying the price. Meanwhile, the woman received an unexpected offer. A group of investors approached her, suggesting that with her leadership, the company could move in a better direction without her ex-husband. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had spent so much time trying to erase her now faced the very real possibility of being erased himself. She had the power to make that decision, to take away everything he had once used to belittle her. But was that the path she wanted to take? She sat with the offer in front of her, thinking carefully. Revenge was tempting, but it was never what she had sought. What mattered was reclaiming her worth, not destroying his. She had already won, she didn't need to take everything from him to prove it. With that clarity, she made her decision. Instead of pushing him out completely, she negotiated terms that allowed her to step into a leadership role while ensuring that the company continued to thrive. It was a compromise that gave her control without resorting to the same tactics he had once used against her. When the ex-husband learned of her decision, he was stunned. He had expected her to take everything, to humiliate him as he had tried to humiliate her. Instead, she had chosen the path of dignity, proving once again that she was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. He had spent years believing he held all the power, but in the end, she had been the one to make the final call. The courtroom battle had ended, but its effects rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The woman had not only secured her rightful place in the company but had also redefined herself in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. The ex-husband, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of his actions. His influence had waned, his reputation had been shattered, and the empire he had so desperately clung to was no longer solely his. As she walked out of the courthouse for the last time, the weight of the past finally lifted from her shoulders. She had spent years allowing herself to be diminished, but now, she stood tall. She had fought for herself, and she had won, not just in court, but in life. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities she had once thought lost. And as she stepped forward, she knew one thing for certain: she would never let anyone define her worth again. For the ex-husband, the trial had been the beginning of his downfall. For the woman, it had been the start of something new. And as the courtroom doors closed behind them, their lives would never be the same again.